Welcome to the Book Blast podcast and our international podcast series, Bridging the Divide, Translation and the Art of Empathy. We are showcasing a selection of the best writing in translation from around the world being published this year in the UK by 10 leading independent houses, along with a trailblazing publisher specialising in translation. Today I am interviewing Rose from Eland Publishing, dedicated to publishing books about the world and its many cultures and societies. We are joined by Robyn Marsack, who has translated a series of books by Nicolas Bouvier for Eland. He was a traveller in the real sense of the word, writing about now forgotten communities. This interview is being recorded via Zoom during the COVID-19 lockdown. Thank you, Rose and Robyn, for coming to be interviewed. You bought Eland 15 years ago and have built up a remarkable collection of distinctively and beautifully designed books about the world and its many cultures and societies. Tell us about the classics list, the originals list, Dervla Murphy, and some of your personal favourites.
Yeah, we bought it, I think, in fact, 20 years ago now. It's a rather strange hybrid of a publishing company. It's not... the majority of our list is composed of brilliant books that have fallen off the back of other people's publishing lists. Books that we feel shouldn't have been allowed to go out of print. Books that we've therefore brought back into print, and we have a sort of a USP of keeping all our titles in print. So once we take on a book, we keep it in print forever. So in a sense, we're kind of staking our business on the brilliance of a book itself and the feeling that it will continue to appeal to new generations of readers. So the business is that, the classics list. But over the years, a number of very interesting books have come our way, new books, new travel books. And we have occasionally been tempted to publish new books, including, they've all come in different come to us in different ways. And the book we're going to be talking about later on really was the product of our own passion for Nicolas Bouvier's work. So this new translation was something that we really wanted to do because there were parts of his oeuvre which had never been translated and which were obviously very important. Otherwise, we've published, I think about a dozen new original books over the years. As for personal favourites, one of them has to be The Way of the World by Nicolas Bouvier, which I stumbled on in 2006. I fell completely head over heels in love with, and was very sad to discover that Bouvier had actually died 8 years before I found that book. Other books that I love, I have a particular passion for Russia, and so I also love Journey into the Mind's Eye, which I know is close to your heart, Georgia, by Leslie Blanche, yeah. And I suppose Full Tilt, another book that's so interestingly parallel to Nicolas Bouvier's The Way of the World. Full Tilt by Dervla Murphy. Almost exactly the same journey in many ways, from Europe to Pakistan. Her journey was made 10 years after Bouvier. So Bouvier travelled in 1953 and Dervla made her journey in 1963. And they are both absolutely stupendous in their very, very different ways. And actually it's very interesting to read them close to one another.
And you mentioned Pakistan there. One of your originals is Isambard Wilkinson, is it? Yeah.
That's right, yeah. He was a journalist there for a long period of time, and he's a very spirited character. And so as well as a sort of a deep analysis of the political scene, he's forever partying in the back streets of Lahore.
So your rediscoveries, you mentioned some, but they include Gavin Maxwell, Norman Lewis, Jonathan Robyn, Martha Gellhorn, Leslie Blanche, Roger Vaillant. Publishing classics requires a special acuity. What makes a classic?
Yeah, such a difficult thing to put your finger on. Yeah. And what I often say is, you know one when you read one. They have a kind of a timeless quality to them, an intelligence that goes way beyond the specificity of the setting or the content. the kind of book that you could confidently put into the hand of any reader and know that, if it's the right time for them, they will enjoy it.
Tom Rosenthal said of the late, great Sonny Mehta that he was able to handle the crudest commerce and the finest literature with equal skill. This paradoxical challenge is faced by all publishers. How do you manage to balance crude commerce and literary finesse?
Well, I wouldn't put myself anywhere close to Sonny Mehta in my ability to do that. As I said earlier, Eland is a very particular kind of beast. I suppose I'm more interested in the latter than the former. I'm more interested in the finest literature than the crudest commerce. Crude commerce,
yeah.
Yeah, and Eland hasn't, hasn't been a massive success by crude commercial standards, but it very happily trots along, manages to do a bit more than wash its own face, and we're immensely proud of it. I think we concentrate more on the literary quality than we do on the commerce. Because we're a very small business, we've always felt we have to be absolutely passionate about the books that we publish in order to give you the staying power to put in the time and the energy that is required to try to get a book out to its readership. So we have to love something very, very passionately in order to stake our money on it and to get fully behind it.
You do, of course, want the books to reach as many people, read by as many people as possible. So then I suppose crude commerce is right at the other extreme of that. So therefore these days, and there's a great deal of competition out there, so is beautiful writing enough to sell a book these days, or is it all about marketing and how it can change things?
There is, as you say, immense competition. I think there are 180,000 new titles published in the UK every year. So if you think about that, you can lie down and just sort of give up. The thing about Eland that we've always stuck to is this idea of being a niche, having our own niche. It's been very important in terms of marketing for us. We are absolutely known for producing travel books and travel books only. We've found that over the years that it's become a brand that people recognise, and there aren't very many brands in publishing. There are brands in like Carcanet, Blood Axe, Poetry. Having Eland as recognised and keeping to the same livery so that people really know an Eland book when they see one. We have the devoted readership. We have people who buy every book that we publish. So that's that allows us to get a book out into the world. And because we keep all our titles in print, there are endless opportunities. We communicate regularly with our regular readership. We have plenty of opportunities to sort of profit from unexpected. I was just thinking that the release earlier this year of that the film The Lighthouse, it allowed us a marvellous opportunity to get the word out about a fantastic book that we have on our backlist by Tony Parker about lighthouse keepers. He was Britain's most fantastic oral historian, and he gave a voice to people who wouldn't otherwise be heard, and one of his books was about lighthouse keepers. And so we took the opportunity to put out on social media. That's produced quite a number of sales.
Looking into your crystal ball, in the wake of Brexit and now the coronavirus pandemic, what does the future hold for so-called traditional publishing, in your view?
It's been so interesting because when digital came in, there was a terrible fear that publishers would go the way of original music producers, and that people would no longer buy traditional physical print books, which has proven to be largely untrue. There's something about the book which has really endured, and I think it has something to do with childhood memories. Most people who become readers in later life have very, very fond memories of being curled up on the lap of a parent or beside one, or lying in bed, or reading a book when they were sick or something, and that endures, that feeling of being able to curl up wherever you want and lose yourself in another world and feel a kind of kinship with other people from with very different experiences from different backgrounds. I have a Kindle and I read obviously we produce ebooks, and so I check all our ebook proofs. And obviously that is that's a helpful adjunct to a publishing business, being able to sell ebooks as well. And I think books are people relish that escape from the kind of fast, frantic digital world which we all have to inhabit so much of the time.
The Swiss traveller, writer and photographer Nicolas Bouvier is unusual in the way he writes in a stream of consciousness about the world around him and how he feels in the instant so directly and openly. In The Scorpionfish, his description of a bomb blowing up a bus and the grisly aftermath is not only very beautifully written, but mirrors his inner collapse and feeling of physical decrepitude, as actually is an extraordinary description of termites and insects which populate the book incredibly, and one sort of wonders what's going on. How fragmented is he feeling internally? You said, how did you come across him? You just stumbled across Way of the World, or?
Yeah, it was a reference somewhere, and running a backlist publishing company, you're always got your antennae out for new possible books that have fallen out of print, that have been neglected and forgotten somewhere, and we have lots of people who keep us abreast, or who make suggestions to us. Did The Way of the World, or whether I might have been following a trail of some kind into the internet. I got a sort of feeling in my stomach that this was going to be a good book, and I got hold of a copy of the version that Robyn had already translated. Or I think it was Polygon, wasn't it, Robyn?
It was. It was.
Yeah. It was a marvelous moment. One of those moments which doesn't happen very often, when I finish reading a book and really wish that I could ring up the author and speak to them. And sadly, I discovered that Bouvier had already died, and I've been sort of pursuing him in one way or another ever since. Reading different bits, watching clips of him on YouTube. I've really tried terribly hard to get hold of his the recordings he made as he journeyed, because as well as being a writer, he was quite a gifted musician. He and Thierry Vernet, who he travelled with, was also a musician, and they spent a lot of time recording music in the Balkans, in Iran. Somewhere there is a treasury, I suspect, actually, probably in the library in Geneva, and I must go and pull them out.
He does describe wonderfully cafes and people. There's the old man playing an accordion, is it? Or no, a bagpipe, that's right.
Yeah. It's
a fabulous description, and Vernet's drawings.
Yeah.
I did meet him in Geneva, yes, and also in Glasgow. I translated a book of his before I met him, though we had some correspondence, and he was a wonderful writer, and because he had such an acute visual sense, his handwriting was fantastic. It actually looks a bit like a thicket of thorns, but it is a wonderful moment when you open an envelope and you see such distinctive and individual handwriting. I always got a handwritten letter, and so we corresponded a little when I translated The Scorpionfish. I translated that when I was at Carcanet, and the book came to us through George Steiner. He, of course, was living in Geneva for part of the time, and he wrote to Michael Schmidt at Carcanet and said, there's this marvelous book by a man called Nicolas Bouvier called The Scorpionfish, or The Poisson Scorpion, and he called it, Steiner, a dark, sparkling little masterpiece. And Michael, who doesn't read French, passed it over to me and said, what do you think? And I read it and I said, it's a wonderful, wonderful book. He said, very well, you go ahead, you translate it. So that was, talking about the publisher as a gambler, I would say that was a huge gamble. I had only translated one book before from French. So I did go ahead and translate it, and we had some correspondence. And to me, it's a real shame that he didn't meet Rose and Barnaby and know about Eland, because this would have been a publishing house at which he felt very much at home in. He loved people who understood visual culture, as Eland does. If you only have to look at their book covers, a beautiful, beautiful cover that Rose has composed for So It Goes. But he himself was an iconograph, what he called a stalker of images. So he was a collector and a stalker of images. He was a photographer, so he understood all of that, and he would have relished Eland's way of presenting their books, but also he felt himself to be very attuned to a tradition of writing in English about travelling. He loved, for example, Robert Louis Stevenson. He loved Henry Miller.
Mm-hmm. So Carcanet, of course, are really known for their poetry, but then you mentioned Polygon. I'm just curious, finding a home with Eland, did he have rather a checkered publishing experience in English before?
Unusually, I mean, he wasn't published in English. The Scorpion Fish, I think, but Rose might correct me here, it was the first translation into English, and then, but they definitely didn't want to do a travel book. And The Scorpion Fish, I think now we would call it autofiction.
Yes.
Yes, it's not quite travel.
It's not quite travel. It's hallucinatory, but we can come back to that.
It is absolutely. Yeah, we'll come
but
back
The Way
to
of the World then was his classic book that had been published in 1963, as Rose said, in French, and that the fact that that hadn't been translated was quite extraordinary. And I knew then the person who was the editor at Polygon, Peter Kravitz, and he commissioned a report on The Way of the World from a very good translator who said, yes, this is definitely something that's worth putting out into the world. And so Polygon, a very adventurous publisher at that stage, and indeed since, published that in 1992. So that came out in 1992 and made its way along, but then lapsed. As Rose says, things fall into their backlist and then
that's
they
what
disappear.
Happens. They fall off a cliff, that people don't always realise.
Even such a wonderful book as that. There's something about him that is unlike, I think, almost any other travel writer. His willingness to completely lose himself in the pursuit of some kind of an understanding of the situation he finds himself in. He seems to be willing to bear himself in a way that very few other travel writers that I can think of do. He has this fantastic, he was always famously very proud that it had taken him longer to get to Japan, because the journey of The Way of the World begins in Geneva. They go, the whole of The Way of the World takes him to India, then he crosses India, goes to Ceylon, where the story from the Scorpion Fish occurs. Then he takes a boat and goes to Japan. It took him longer to get to Japan than it took Marco Polo.
I know, that's exactly, he sort of loops off and
and
stays. That's proper travelling. He's
willing to give it time it needs for him to be able to absorb. And in The Way of the World, one of the wonderful things about The Way of the World is that he and Thierry, his travelling companion, who was this fantastic artist and who did the wonderful black and white illustrations for the book, they stopped every winter. They stopped somewhere. So they spent the whole of one winter in Tabriz and
in Azerbaijan. Yes, that's wonderful. That description.
Exactly, and they really got to know it. And they tried to make money. They had shows. He was writing as much as he could, was selling his art. They allowed themselves the time to get very immersed, and they got into there's a fantastic relationship they have with the innkeeper in Quetta, where they end up in Pakistan, and it really allows them to inhabit a place and to get to know it in a particular way. As a writer, I think it's very important with him to remember how musical he was and how interested he was in music. I think as a stylist, having a musical ear is incredibly important. And there's something about his prose that I think is like music.
And it's very filmic as well. It's very strong, but not sort of aggressively so, if you like.
I think he says an interesting thing. He says the traveller is always an enigma. He is at home everywhere and nowhere. His is a life of stolen moments, reflections, minute sensations, chance discoveries, and odds and ends. So when you talk about him pursuing something, it's not really a pursuit. It's the odds and ends. It's the minutiae. It's the, as Rose said, living in the present moment that are really important to him. And one doesn't feel that he has an overarching purpose. He goes where he can go, and he lives in that place to the utmost of his ability, which includes knowing about its history, absorbing its art, thinking about its language and its music and the culture in a very both deeply informed but also immediate way.
It's not the way he weaves in, whether he's writing about the Iron Diary, Scotland or Korea or China, I mean the various different places and cultures he writes about, it's lightly done, so it's very readable and you absorb it. There's no, because you don't feel you're being sort of lectured to or anything, it just happens effortlessly.
Well, I think what Robyn said about he doesn't really have an agenda in advance. He is discovering and you're discovering along with him.
Exactly.
And I love the way that I think you get the feeling with him, even in the sort of highly composed final work, you get the feeling with him that he never quite knew what was going to take him into interesting material. So he will just set off. There's a marvellous bit in the Aran Isles on his first night, in the middle of this enormous storm, where he where he goes outside and he bumps into a cart horse. I mean, it's sort of absurd, but absolutely wonderful. He puts himself out in the darkness and he discovers what's there.
Could I just say about translating So It Goes, that and thinking about lecturing, the interesting thing for me was because it covers quite a lot of territory, So It Goes, from Arran to the lowlands of Scotland to China to Korea. I tried to check up on things, but that's there is an element of impressionistic knowledge in Bouvier as well as deep knowledge.
There is an extraordinary series of very different people that he encounters on the way. The Chinese tour guide is a wonderful character.
It's a wonderful portrait.
Like a nail sticking out, who's what's that image he has? It like he's a nail sticking out.
Who hasn't been bashed in?
Yes. Hasn't, or is that's right? They're trying to bash in, but isn't. What are some of the characters, Robyn, that you particularly?
Well, I think
rather endearing in his writing.
I think that that character sticks out for me. The Chinese guide is a marvelous portrait, and really that section about China is about that guide and what kind of insight the person on the ground who was Chinese and was deeply read, understood about China. This person also, of course, spoke very good French, and one finds out that he had buried a Larousse dictionary in his garden through the years of the Cultural Revolution in order to protect it. It's an extraordinary portrait. The friend Terence and Keta in The Way of the World is a marvellous portrait of a certain kind of, shall I say, Englishman washed up in the Indian continent. That's a marvellous portrait. And in the Korean section, he managed to travel there with his wife, whom I had met once, and it gave a kind of lightness of spirit to his travels there, and which he said himself it was a huge pleasure for him. Mostly he did travel alone, and he liked traveling alone, but he felt the isolation, and this traveling with his wife in Korea was more like a holiday for him. There's a moment in that where they have gone up a mountain and come back down again in a day, which nobody did. That was just the wrong thing to do, but he hadn't looked up any guides. So it was an extraordinary feat and very difficult and very frustrating. And they were sliding down at night, and they came across somebody who was patrolling the area. And he had a gun with him, and he looked ready to challenge them. But then they have a conversation, and Bouvier is able to talk to him in Japanese. And of course, the island had been occupied by the Japanese, so he got to the bottom of why this man was so jumpy. And it was not only the ghosts on that mountain, but also because his wife was expecting a baby and he was very anxious about it. So there was this human connection there that's felt to me very typical of Bouvier's interactions, though he also was very cross with some people he met and annoyed by them and so forth, and you hear that too. But that interaction in the middle of the night, in the middle of Korea, in quite a dangerous situation, was a wonderful piece of both comedy and humanity.
But all three books is a great interest in mystery, occult,
Absolutely.
Magic, a lot of occult Celtic goings on in the Scottish.
There's a combination. There is a great deal of drink taken in these books.
And he's often ill.
And
feverish and ill, yeah.
I think that is the key, that he's often feverish and ill. And especially in the Scorpion Fish, he is. And in the Arran Journal, he's not drinking at all, because apart from tea, because he has a fever. And this feverish state often heightens his senses in extraordinary ways, and also provides him with this access to a slightly different world or a slightly different dimension. And one doesn't feel that he's inventing that in any way, or that he's playing with it. It's a serious business for him.
Books span decades. Starting in the 50s, Bouvier writes, "You don't travel in order to deck yourself with exoticism and anecdotes like a Christmas tree, but so that the root plucks you, rinses you, wrings you out, makes you like one of those towels, threadbare with washing, that are handed out with slivers of soap in brothels. You leave far behind you the excuses or curses of your birthplace, and each filthy bundle lugged about in crowded waiting rooms, on little station platforms, appalling in their heat and misery, you see your own coffin going by. Without this detachment and lucidity, how can you hope to convey what you have seen? But could you travel the way he did and where he did today? I mean, in today's world, what's your take on then and now, really? His perception.
Well, obviously you couldn't do the way of the world from Geneva to the Khyber Pass in the way that he did in the 50s, and madly in the little Fiat Topolino, which is always breaking down. It's like a third character in the book, the car, Thierry and Nicolas together. And I thought it was genius of Rose to find that photograph of Bouvier in the car for the cover, because it looks like a turtle, actually. So you couldn't do that because of the boundaries, the changed boundaries, and the surveillance and so forth. And of course now you have all sorts of navigational aids and telephones and so forth that Bouvier never had. So no, it's not the same. It's not just the practicalities of travel that make the difference in Bouvier's writing. It's a sensibility that is very far from being a journalist's sensibility. No harm meant to journalists. I read travel journalism with pleasure, but this is a real writer and thinker, and somebody who doesn't, on the whole, have to report in to a deadline. Indeed, waits 10 years before he might put his reflections down about one thing or another. So it's a very different. He is much less constrained than many writers would be, who would be thinking about when they had to deliver a manuscript or an article, though he certainly did write to make money from time to time.
Or in fact an angle. He writes of British folly and pillage of India. He's critical of the trade in ideologies. He's got very strong views, and also there's that whole section in where he writes about Armenians.
He has a very sharp view of the individual nature of people and places and cultures. So that is all, of course, extremely valuable, as it always is, and good writers who can open windows onto other worlds for us and make us feel empathetic. I just come back to that sensibility and the passage you read about seeing your own coffin go past. There is underneath it all a very acute consciousness of mortality. That is his individual sensibility, so you can't expect that to be replicated in other writers. That's one of his defining characteristics, I think, and accounts for a strain of melancholy, I would say, a sort of sobriety underlying all of this, and also an acute appreciation of the moments of beauty and revelation.
Yes, and I think his awareness of his mortality and of the passage of time.
Yes,
something that absolutely allows him. Well, it makes him more sensitive to the moment and to the beauty around him.
Yes, because he writes, "It is best to know one's prayers by heart and make them short. One disappears quickly, even if it's while dancing." There are thoughts and messages and philosophies that come out of it.
You're right about philosophies, and he is widely read both in the classics and I think in Buddhism and traditions of Switzerland, so knew about both Catholicism and Calvinism, and Calvinism is something he feels very strongly about and against. Yes, there is that underlying philosophical cast of mind, I would say.
And he also sees there's a sort of, it's very beautifully done, there's a certain brutality as well. There's that extraordinary description in the autobiographical piece right at the end of So It Goes, describing the death of a rat, spraying the walls with blood as its carotid artery is gashed by a flying fragment of glass in a dusty Bosnian cafe. It's extraordinary. And then also that is immediately followed by his father's death from a ruptured aorta. I thought that was rather an interesting juxtaposition.
He's not afraid of visiting those difficult aspects of life, and of human existence, of experience. In fact, he's fascinated by them. And I think that's what opens him in a way to goes beyond the world that a lot of people see. He's open to something that is of a different realm, of a different way of perceiving life in a way.
I think you used the word earlier, exposed, and I think that that's a good word as well as open to describe him, that he was very open to other cultures and ways of looking at things, but he also was not afraid of exposing himself. In fact, he thought, as I think you made clear in that earlier quotation, Georgia, he wasn't afraid of being completely vulnerable to whatever came along. And so he is in that way fearless, I think, and fearless in writing about it.
He is absolutely not, he is part of the scene. He's there's nothing judgmental or dare I say it, patronizing sometimes.
Yes.
Some writers can be patronizing, and he just gets right, he's just himself. And maybe that's also why the people he comes across seem to take to him. They just get on in the end, even when there are one or two incidents he describes when there is one incident where he's rather scared and he has to get out. That's a slightly creepy magic moment. He's not some lofty observer and almost voyeuristic the way, perhaps that's also what dates some writing. You feel slightly the them and us thing, and there's none of that with him. As you say, he's absolutely, it's just there it all is. Robyn, you were going to read a passage that exemplifies the essence of his writing and voice and spirit that you particularly love, I think from one of his Scottish pieces.
Yes, so this comes from the volume of essays, So It Goes, that Rose commissioned, putting together 3 essays that were published in one book. And so since I'm here in Glasgow, I've chosen a piece from the essay Scotland Travels in the Lowlands. And he's writing about one of the 3 most beautiful roads in the world, he says. He's got one in the Swiss canton of Vaud, and he's got one in Chinese Turkestan, and here, unexpectedly, is one in the lowlands of Scotland. The road, which climbs from Capaclu to the Megget Reservoir, then drops down to the Tala Reservoir, is a cantata for 4 voices: water, hills, clouds, and the narrow shining ribbon of a road which climbs and descends at incredible angles, a succession of humpbacks and little passes. It is just wide enough for 1 car, only occasionally offering a passing place. But there's nobody else around on this splendid morning, and the saturated hills breathe and hiss and rise to touch the pale yellow clouds rushing through the blue sky. The hills are emerald green, flecked with saffron and bright brown, like a plane tree leaf beginning to yellow. No sign of any housing in this vast space, but sheep by the thousands, scattered across such huge slopes that they look like sleet caught in sunlight rather than real animals. Driving for a long time, carefully, without meeting another living soul, I am intoxicated by this Apollonian spectacle. Then, widening my eyes, I discovered the minute red mark of a shepherd, no bigger than a lowercase I, miles above the road. I got out my binoculars and leaned against the bank. It was his scarf that was red. I saw him squat down, cupping his hands to make the sound reach his dog, whose spine rippled as he speedily wound between the sheep and called out in his dog language. A moment afterwards, lovely funereal music rose from the car. I had left the radio on. A cloud hid the sun, and, in the blink of an eye, this vast countryside became deathly, with unimaginable suddenness and violence. I saw the shepherd caught in an uncompleted gesture like a pillar of salt. The dog, coiled up, was no more than a lifeless ball of hair. For 30 miles around, sheep were lying on the slopes, their legs already rigid. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the rusting carcass of my new car pushed aside to clear the road. The same unearthly music continued to issue forth, and the sky was a huge bowl of smoky crystal. This retinal image lasted about 20 seconds. Then the sun came out, and everything resumed moving and the appearance of reality. Other landscapes have played a similar trick on me. Once when I was walking along the verge of a half-dry river south of Isfahan, another time in a twilit wasteland suburb of Nagoya, still pockmarked with bomb craters, full to the brim with June rain, where a solitary young woman, naked to the waist, was doing motocross. I took to my heels, but that was a long time ago. Not this time. Today I know that some places, the Bretons say care, either exceptionally hideous or splendid, and where man is almost absent, fool us like smokes and mirrors, steal from our hearts a latent image, and enlarge it like a gigantic magnifier. It's true to say that on entering this deserted, indescribable region, I hadn't seen anything as beautiful in a long time. I had thought of death at the same time as reflecting how miraculous it was to be alive, precisely there. I returned to the car at 11:59. At midday, the music which had accompanied this strange trip stopped. It was Sibelius's Symphony No. 1. Through an amphitheatre of rounded mountains, from here on silent and swollen like risen loaves of bread, I descended towards the Tala Reservoir.
So It Goes, The Way of the World and Scorpionfish are published by Eland Publishing and are available from online outlets such as Waterstones, Foyles, Donk Books, Hive and Amazon. To buy them from your local independent bookseller, you can find your nearest store by visiting www.booksellers.org.uk/bookshop search. To find out more about Eland Publishing and their books, visit website www.travelbooks.co.uk and their Twitter feed is @Eland Publishing. This podcast is brought to you by Book Blast. For more bookishness between episodes, visit online journal The Book Blast Diary or find us on Twitter @BookBlast. Special thanks to sound editor Rupert Such, theme tune composer Edward Campbell, and to translator Robyn Marsack and publisher Rose Rogerson for taking the time to be interviewed. And thank you all for listening to this week's episode of the Book Blast podcast.